My cheating wife kicked me out on her boss' birthday. Years later, she showed up wanting my house. I just smiled. What my wife never knew, the night she ended our marriage in a hallway at her boss's party, was that the house she called ours was never actually hers to claim. That single secret, buried in a filing cabinet for years, was about to become the only thing that mattered when she came back smiling, expecting me to still be the man she left behind. Viewers, before you continue, please subscribe, like and share. My name is Rash Monk. I'm a structural engineer, 36 years old, born and raised in Denver, Colorado, the kind of city where the mountains watch everything and forgive nothing. For 9 years I was married to a woman named Paige Rash, and even now her name catches in my throat like a stone I swallowed too fast. We met when I was 27, still pouring concrete on weekends to pay off student loans, and she was 25, ambitious in a way that made men nervous and impressed in equal measure. I thought her ambition was something I admired. I never imagined it would one day be aimed at me. We built a house together on Lowry Boulevard, 3 acres my grandmother left me before she died, land she'd refused to sell to developers for 30 years because she believed, in her words, that patience outlives every promise made on top of money. I poured the foundation myself on weekends. Paige picked the paint colors and told her friends the house was ours, though the deed, quietly, carefully, was only ever in my name. I didn't think about that detail for years. I had no reason to. I believed we were building a life, not a legal argument. Looking back, I can see the cracks now, small ones, the late nights at the office she never explained, the way she'd angle her phone away from me at dinner, the perfume that wasn't hers I once found on a jacket she said belonged to a coworker. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself 9 years of marriage had earned us both the benefit of the doubt. I was wrong, and the night I learned exactly how wrong began with an invitation I should never have accepted, to a party that was never meant to include me at all, hosted by a man named Garrett Whitlock, the developer my wife worked for, the man whose 50th birthday would become the night my entire life quietly ended. I straightened my tie, smiling, with no idea what was waiting for me. The party was at a glass-walled estate in the Denver foothills, the kind of house that made our own feel modest by comparison, with marble floors and a chandelier the size of a small car. Garrett Whitlock turned 50 that night, surrounded by investors, real estate brokers, and a small army of catering staff carrying trays I never touched because my stomach was tight with something I couldn't name. Paige had told me to wear the navy suit, to use the side entrance, and not to embarrass her in front of people who mattered to her career. I should have heard the warning folded inside that sentence. I didn't. I watched her move through that crowd like she'd rehearsed it, laughing at jokes I hadn't heard, touching Whitlock's arm in a way that lingered half a second too long for two people who were only boss and employee. I told myself it was nothing. I'd told myself that so many times by then it had become a reflex instead of a belief. What I didn't know yet, what I wouldn't learn until much later, was that Whitlock had hired Paige 4 years earlier not because of her resume but because something about her reminded him of the wife he'd already lost, and he'd been quietly cultivating her loyalty ever since, one promotion, one bonus, one late dinner at a time. Near midnight, Whitlock raised a glass and said something that pulled a laugh from the entire room except me, because I hadn't heard the joke, hadn't been let in on whatever private world the two of them had built without me noticing. Paige laughed the loudest. Her hand stayed on his shoulder a beat too long. I remember the exact moment the warmth drained out of the room for me, though nobody else seemed to feel it. I remember thinking, just for a second, that something was about to break. I had no idea I was right, or how quickly, or how publicly it would happen, right there, under those string lights, in front of 40 people who weren't mine. She pulled me aside near the back hallway, away from the music, away from the laughter, and for one absurd second I thought she wanted to dance. Her smile from minutes earlier was gone, replaced by something colder and more practiced than anything I'd seen from her in 9 years of marriage. "I want a divorce," she said, flat, like she was reading a grocery list. "I should have told you weeks ago," she added, "but tonight is easier, because everyone already thinks we're separated." I laughed, actually laughed, because my mind couldn't process the sentence as real, couldn't fold it into anything that matched the woman I'd married at 27, the woman who used to fall asleep with her hand on my chest. She wasn't joking. "I need you to leave," she said again, quieter this time, "don't make a scene." 40 strangers stood 20 feet away, laughing at something none of them would remember tomorrow, while my entire marriage ended in a hallway that smelled like candle wax and someone else's cologne. My coat was in a closet I no longer had permission to open. My car was 3 blocks away because valet had run out of space an hour earlier. I walked out into October air that cut straight through my suit jacket, past the same string lights that had looked romantic an hour before and now just looked cruel. Behind me, the music started again almost immediately, like the room had simply absorbed the absence of me and moved on without missing a beat. I reached my car with my hands shaking, fumbling for keys I could barely hold, and my phone buzzed once in my pocket. A text from a number I didn't recognize. "You deserve to know the truth about the house," it read. I stared at those 7 words for a long time in the dark, certain they meant something, with absolutely no idea yet how long it would take me to understand exactly what. I sat there a long time, engine off, watching windows glow in a house that was never mine. I spent that night on my coworker's couch, staring at a popcorn ceiling, replaying 9 years like a film reel stuck on the worst frame. By morning I still hadn't slept, and my mind kept circling back to a summer 11 years earlier, before any of this, before Paige, before Whitlock, before string lights and hallway confessions. My grandmother had handed me a folded deed across her kitchen table, 3 acres on the edge of Denver she'd refused to sell for 30 years despite developers knocking on her door every few seasons with bigger numbers each time. She told me, in the dry, certain way she said most things, that the land stays in your name and only your name, no matter what life brings you, because patience outlives every promise built on top of it. I didn't understand what she meant then. I built that house with my own hands over 2 years, pouring the foundation on weekends, framing walls after 12-hour shifts, while Paige picked paint colors and told her friends the house was ours. I let her say it. I never corrected her, not once, because correcting her felt unnecessary, even unkind, like pointing out a small lie that didn't hurt anyone. I had no idea that small unspoken truth, the one sitting quietly in a filing cabinet downtown, would someday matter more than anything either of us had said out loud during our entire marriage. The morning after the party, my phone buzzed again. "Paige. We need to talk about the house," the message read, for words that sounded almost casual, almost reasonable, as if the night before hadn't happened at all. I stared at the screen for a long time, thinking about my grandmother's hands folding that deed, thinking about patience, thinking about promises built on land that was never actually shared. I had no idea, not yet, how much that single text would come to haunt her, years later, when she finally understood exactly what she'd given away by walking out that hallway smiling. I had no idea about any of that, not yet. Mediation happened on a Tuesday morning in a downtown Denver office with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly sick. Paige walked in wearing a blazer I didn't recognize, clutching a designer bag like armor, sitting across the table with the kind of confidence that comes from being told something by a lawyer who hadn't actually checked the facts first. She expected half of everything, the retirement accounts, the savings, and especially the house, the one she'd spent years quietly describing to friends as ours, even mentioning it once to Whitlock during a conversation about leaving me for someone who could, in her words, actually provide. My lawyer slid a folder across the table without a word. Inside sat the original deed from my grandmother, construction permits dated 2 years before our wedding, and property tax filings that had never once listed Paige's name anywhere on any page. Colorado courts don't always split everything evenly, especially when one piece of property was never marital in the first place, separate from the very beginning, documented years before either of us said any vows out loud. I watched her face change as she read, the color draining slowly, the confidence cracking at the edges like ice under too much weight too fast. "This isn't right," she said, voice tight, almost trembling. "It's been right since before we married," I told her, calmer than I felt, my hands steady only because I'd practiced saying that sentence in the mirror the night before. She stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor, loud enough that the receptionist outside glanced through the glass. "You'll regret this," she said, eyes sharp, voice low enough that only I could hear it. I didn't understand what she meant, not that day, not for a long time after. I assumed it was anger talking, the kind people say in rooms like that and forget by the parking lot. I had no idea those 4 words were a promise she intended to keep, years later, on my own front porch. I didn't know memory could wait that long. I sold most of what I owned that didn't matter and drove south on I-25 with a U-Haul trailer rattling behind me, watching Denver shrink in the rearview mirror until the mountains disappeared completely. Phoenix felt like a different planet, all dry heat and wide empty highways, exactly the kind of place where nobody knew my name or my marriage or the hallway where it ended. I took a contract job with a small structural firm working on commercial sites outside Scottsdale, mostly because the pay was steady and I didn't have the energy left to negotiate for more. Within a few months I met a developer named Holloway Briggs, a quiet man in his 60s who'd built 3 separate fortunes and lost 2 of them, and who looked at blueprints the way other men looked at family photographs. He needed an engineer who showed up early and didn't complain, and somehow that was enough to impress him in ways my marriage never had. Within a year he offered me equity instead of just a paycheck, a small percentage in a handful of mixed-use properties going up along a growth corridor the city hadn't even approved yet. I said yes mostly because I had nothing left to lose and nobody left to disappoint. I didn't understand then how much that single decision would matter 3 years later, when the city expanded its boundary exactly where Holloway had quietly predicted it would. I wasn't trying to get rich. I was trying to feel useful again, to wake up and have a reason that wasn't anger. One night, an old mutual friend called from Denver, mentioning almost casually that Whitlock had quietly divorced his own wife that same year. Paige had apparently expected a different kind of announcement entirely. I didn't feel satisfaction hearing it. I felt something colder, quieter, like a door closing somewhere far away that I hadn't realized was still open. I sat there alone with that thought a long time that night, wondering quietly what she'd traded me for, and whether she even understood the answer yet herself. 2 years after the divorce, a federal investigation into Whitlock's development company surfaced in a Denver business journal a friend forwarded me without comment, just a link and a single question mark, as if even he didn't know what to say about it. The article described inflated property valuations used to secure investor loans, numbers padded just enough to look ambitious instead of fraudulent until someone finally checked the math. Paige's name appeared near the bottom, described as a senior associate with, quote, no apparent knowledge of the irregularities, despite 6 years working directly under the man whose signature was on every falsified document. I read that sentence 3 times, trying to decide if I believed it, trying to decide if it even mattered anymore whether I did. A former coworker called a few weeks later, the kind of call where you can tell someone's been waiting for an excuse to share something, and told me Paige had stayed with Whitlock nearly 2 years after our divorce, quietly believing he'd marry her once his own messy separation finally settled into something clean. He never did. When the company collapsed under subpoenas and frozen accounts, so did the apartment she'd leased before our marriage even officially ended, so did the car, so did whatever version of her future she'd built in place of the one she walked away from at his birthday party. She was, by every account that reached me secondhand, starting completely over in her 40s with none of the security she used to mock me for not having fast enough. I didn't feel triumphant hearing it, though I expected to. I felt something closer to recognition, the strange quiet feeling of watching karma move slowly instead of all at once. A mutual friend mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Paige had recently been asking questions about Denver property values, specifically near Lowry Boulevard. I didn't think much of it at the time. I should have. I didn't connect it yet to the new rail line the city council had just quietly approved right near my old front door. What Paige never knew, what almost nobody in our old circle knew, was that the city's new light rail extension ran directly along the border of my grandmother's land, approved the year after our divorce finalized, the same parcel she'd refused to sell 3 separate times in the 80s when developers came knocking with cash offers that would have changed her life overnight. She used to tell me, sitting on that same porch decades before I ever built anything on it, that land outlives every promise made on top of it, that people change their minds about love and money and loyalty constantly, but dirt simply waits, patient and unbothered, for whoever understands its actual worth. She'd watched 3 different men try to convince her she was foolish for holding onto empty acreage instead of cashing out like everyone else on the block eventually did. "Somebody in this family is going to thank me for this one day," she told my mother once, years before I was even married, years before any of us could have guessed which version of me would end up standing on that land alone. She passed before the rail line was ever proposed, never knowing exactly how right she'd been, never knowing her stubbornness would someday quietly multiply in value while a woman she never fully approved of told her own friends the house belonged to both of us. I kept the property after the divorce, renovated it slowly while I lived and worked in Phoenix, rented it out for 2 years to a young couple who took beautiful care of it, and never once mentioned to anyone in my old social circle what the land had actually become worth. Paige found out a different way entirely, through a real estate agent friend who mentioned my address casually during a conversation about properties that had simply, in her words, gotten lucky. 3 days later my phone rang, an unknown Denver number flashing on the screen, and something in my chest went still before I even answered it. I let it ring twice before I answered. She showed up on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring, driving a leased sedan that didn't quite match the rest of her appearance, her clothes sharper than her circumstances probably allowed, her smile warm in a way that didn't reach her eyes at all. "Rash," she said, standing at the bottom of the porch steps like she still had the right to climb them, "you look good. I was actually hoping we could talk about the house." I almost laughed, the same reflexive laugh from that hallway years earlier, except this time I caught it before it escaped. "I've been thinking," she continued, stepping closer, "legally I probably had more claim to this than I ever pushed for back then. I was young. I made mistakes. But this was our home before it became your investment." She said the word investment like it tasted bitter, like she'd practiced the sentence the whole drive over and still hadn't decided if she believed it herself. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know standing there in the spring sunlight, was that I'd restructured ownership of the property 2 years earlier, folding it quietly into an irrevocable trust connected to Holloway's development partnership, a decision my own lawyer had insisted on after watching exactly how the first divorce had played out. It wasn't simply protected from a future remarriage or some opportunistic lawsuit. It was protected specifically from her, by name, by a clause neither of us had ever discussed out loud. She didn't know about Whitlock's collapse reaching my ears either, didn't know I'd heard about the leased apartment, the repossessed car, the slow unraveling of a future she'd traded 9 years of marriage to chase. "So," she said, stepping even closer now, closer than felt comfortable, "what do you think?" The afternoon light caught the side of her face exactly the way it used to when we were young and none of this had happened yet. I just stood there a moment, feeling nothing close to anger anymore. I just smiled. Whatever she expected from my smile, it wasn't that. "Paige," I said, "you didn't come back for me. You came back for an asset you assumed was still vulnerable, the same way you assumed I'd still be standing in that driveway 9 years ago, waiting quietly for you to decide what I deserved." Her smile finally cracked, just slightly, just enough for me to see the calculation behind it falter. "This house," I continued, "has been sitting inside an irrevocable trust since 2 years ago. It isn't mine to give away anymore, and it was never actually yours to take, no matter how many friends you told otherwise back when none of this seemed worth checking. You can ask a lawyer if you want. I already did, more than once, long before you ever knocked on this door again." I watched something behind her eyes finally break, not heartbreak exactly, something closer to the specific disbelief of realizing you'd bet everything on someone continuing to underestimate himself the way he once underestimated his own worth. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice the way she had in that hallway years earlier. She just stood there a long moment, looking past me at the house she'd once told her friends belonged to both of us, then turned and walked back to her car without another word. I stood on that porch a long time after her taillights disappeared down the street, not gloating the way I once imagined I might if this day ever came, just still, quiet, 9 years of resentment finally settling into something that felt almost like peace. I thought about my grandmother folding that deed across her kitchen table, about patience outliving every promise, about a hallway and 40 strangers and a text message from a number I never identified. I thought about how long it takes some truths to finish arriving. The porch light flickered on as the sun dropped behind the mountains, and for the first time in 9 years, I felt nothing pulling at me from the past. Just the quiet, and the house, finally, entirely my own. Nothing left unfinished now. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like and share for more interesting stories.